The reason is to be found in Suetonius' life of the Emperor Claudius. He expelled the Jews from the city because the Jews in Rome made continual disturbances in the name of Christus. This is the first Latin reference we have to Christus, Christ, and the first reference to the explosive quality of the doctrine. Paul, in fact, was forestalled in his desire to be the first to take the message to the heart of empire. How this early community of Christians actually established themselves in Rome remains a mystery. They might have come out of any of the great trading ports of the East, merchants, peasant immigrants, sailors even, though the Jews were never prominent upon the sea. At any rate, it is quite clear that they had become an irritant in Rome, and although Suetonius does not elaborate, one may reasonably suspect that the disturbances were caused by Orthodox Jews reacting, just as they did in the case of Paul, against what seemed to them a blasphemous assumption based on a misunderstanding of the prophets. It was always the same problem. How could the Jews, a proud and very touchy people, accept that their Messiah had come and had died like a criminal? The one thing that gave them strength during the occupation of the country by the Romans, and the one thing that had given them strength over the centuries of deportations and the dominion of foreign overlords, was the belief that the time would come when the promised Messiah would establish his chosen people and would confound all their enemies. Their faith was being drastically undermined by these followers of Christus, people who consorted with pagans, did not adhere to the strict tenets of law, and who admitted uncircumcised Gentiles into their worship. There was nothing to cling to if their conquering Messiah was demoted in such a violent fashion, nothing to hope for, and no reason for them to feel that the Roman, the Greek, and all other foreigners were basically inferior. What the Christians were saying, in effect, was that the Jewish race was not a special elite, chosen of God since the beginning of time. The disturbances must have been serious, for the Emperor Claudius was not prone to take actions of this nature without good cause. Indeed, in the next few sentences of his biography, Suetonius comments on his treatment of other foreign nationals. When the envoys from Germany visited the theater for the first time, they took their place among the common people. But then, seeing that the Parthian and Armenian envoys were seated with the senators in the orchestra, the semicircular space in front of the stage, they went to join them. For they said, were they not just as brave and as nobly born? Claudius admired their straightforwardness and allowed them to remain there. This was not a man, then, who was inspired by xenophobia, something, in any case, not so common among the Romans. The latter, with all their love of power, were at the same time fairly tolerant of other races and other creeds. They did not care what gods a man worshipped, so long as he conformed to Roman custom, which now included emperor worship, and, of course, so long as he paid his taxes. The Jews, generally speaking, had been prepared to accord ritual tribute to Caesar, and although they were a difficult people to handle, they had been acceptable within the capital. But now it seemed that they had a splinter group within their framework, a group who maintained that some king or other, superior to Caesar, had been upon the world, and promised the imminent extinction of that world, the destruction of Rome and all it stood for, and the triumph of his followers. It was all very difficult for a Roman to understand, and decidedly unpalatable. It seemed also that most of the Jews themselves were against this particular religious belief, and the conflict between the majority and this strange minority was causing trouble in the city. The simplest thing was to expel all Jews, except perhaps those who had clearly shown themselves as conforming to Roman customs. After all, it was extremely difficult to differentiate between the Jews who believed in this Yahweh of theirs, this Zeus or Jupiter-like king of gods, and those who believed in this Christus. Out with them. Claudius's expulsion of the Jews was, as has been seen, far from characteristic of this quiet and scholarly man. Even Suetonius, one of the great gossips of history, a title which takes some earning, could not find a great deal to say against him. True, he appears to have been a glutton, and to have been constantly cuckolded by his wife Messalina. The latter is a misfortune that has happened to many men, and Messalina, who liked to disguise herself and serve as a common whore in a brothel, emerging unsatiated, was something of an exception among the female of the species. Many of Claudius's actions show a tender heart. Discovering that a number of ill or worn-out slaves had been deliberately abandoned by their owners on the island of Aesculapius in the Tiber, so as to avoid looking after them or giving them medical attention, Claudius immediately freed them all. He furthermore declared that any who should recover should never return to their former owner. He added the rider that any slave owner who killed a sick slave should be charged with murder. The provinces of Greece and Macedonia, which Tiberius had made, as it were, his private property, Claudius restored to the Senate. The Lycians, a mountain-dwelling people of southern Asia Minor, whence Paul was to catch his vessel at the port of Myra on his final journey to Rome, he deprived of their national independence in order to punish them for their passion for violent vendettas. On the other hand, he restored the independence of the Rhodians in order to show his appreciation of their recent improvement in behavior. He granted the Trojans, the supposed founders of the Roman race, permanent exemption from tribute. At the same time, while Augustus had been content with prohibiting Roman citizens from taking part in the Druidic cult found in Gaul and in Britain, Claudius decreed that it should be abolished altogether. This was because of his dislike of the practice of divination by the slaughter of a human victim, and most probably, as recorded by Julius Caesar, of their custom of burning men alive in wicker cages. Claudius hardly sounds the kind of man who would have banished the Jews from Rome without some very good reasons. It is important to look at other aspects of his reign, since it was under him that Paul made so many of his travels. It is evidence enough of the smooth administration and efficiency in communications that Paul and his associates could travel so widely, and though punished in various cities for what were considered misdemeanors, without let or hindrance, violence or robbery, over vast territories, not all of which are entirely safe to this day. Indeed, it was not until the 19th or even the 20th century that travel throughout the Mediterranean or the lands bordering it was as well organized as it was in the 1st century A.D. Claudius, although unfortunate with his ill health and his inborn timidity, not surprising in one who had grown up during the reigns of Tiberius and Caligula, was in many respects a good and enlightened ruler. He extended citizenship to many provincials, settled the eastern frontiers, successfully began the conquest of Britain, and expended the imperial treasury wisely in such projects as the Claudian Aqueduct. Mauritania, the area of North Africa, now more or less corresponding to Algeria, was added to the empire during his lifetime. In his dealings with the provinces, despite opposition from the Senate, he continued the liberal policy that had first been evolved by Julius Caesar. Unlike Caesar, however, he did not, perhaps because he did not have to, resort to the wholesale violence and massacre that had accompanied Caesar's conquest of Gaul. The one great fault that characterized the reign of Claudius was his increasing dependence upon talented and rich freedmen. This was a development of the Roman Empire which not unnaturally disgusted the nobly born Romans, but which was made almost inevitable by their proven unreliability and by their basic hostility to the whole concept of the emperor. By the time that Paul was in Thessalonica, and Claudius had only a few more years to live, the influence of the impartial freedmen such as Pallas and Narcissus had become paramount. The emperor preferred to devote his time to his studies, to his historical works, and to his autobiography. All of these, sadly, are lost. They would have told us a great deal that one would have liked to know about this century in which Paul was living and traveling. The virtual rule of freedmen, like that of the eunuchs in the later Ottoman Empire, was not so much inefficient as destructive of the pride of the people who should have been ruling Rome. Decimated by the civil wars, by Tiberius and Caligula, the upper classes clung to the outward show of power, while never holding its reins between their hands. The construction of a new harbor at Ostia, the harbor of Rome, the draining of the Fucine Lake, the building of 2 new aqueducts. All these were on the asset side of Claudius's reign. On the debit side were his increasing dependence on his personal servants, who owed their power and position to him alone, and his fatal capacity for picking the wrong women to share his lonely life. Messalina has rightly passed into history and legend as the outstanding example of a corrupt and sexually insatiable woman, whom Claudius finally had executed. But his next choice was no better. Agrippina had been twice married before she became the wife of the emperor. By her first husband she had had a son, later to become the Emperor Nero, whom she compelled the weak and study-bound emperor to make his heir, in preference to his own son Britannicus by Messalina, to be poisoned by Nero a year after his succession. Agrippina was also Claudius's niece, something that upset the more old-fashioned Romans, since the relationship was considered incestuous. It is doubtful whether Paul was at all familiar with the intricacies of Rome and its power complexities, although he must have got a certain amount by hearsay, especially after he went to Corinth and met some of the Christians who had been expelled. Whatever he heard, it would in any case only have reinforced his determination to bring another kind of order into the world. Despite his initial success in Thessalonica, where he may possibly have hoped to settle for some time and establish the keystone to the church in Greece, he was to encounter the familiar trouble. The Jews of the synagogue detested his message. Sometimes, one feels, Paul, although he was proud of his Pharisaic training and of his Jewishness, must have disliked his race and mentally clung to his Roman citizenship. Nearly all his trouble stemmed from the Jews. Gentiles might not necessarily accept his message, but in general they showed more tolerance than his own people. That, as the Romans had already found out, was the real trouble about the Jewish race. They were the least tolerant of all those within the wide bounds of the empire. They themselves could be tolerated so long as they kept within their own community, as they had always done in the past. But this was a new departure. These Chrestus followers seemed to be a menace to the state. There was a crimen majestatis, crime against the emperor, which seemed to cover the situation, for it was a crime against the emperor to proclaim another king. The Orthodox Jews proclaimed another god. This was acceptable, for there were many gods, and every man was entitled to his own belief. But this new sect, which included not only Jews but members of other races, was saying that their Christ was due to arrive on the earth at any minute, and that he would set up another kingdom. There can be little doubt that Paul, and most of the other early Christians, did literally believe in the imminent arrival of the Messiah. Paul's words, furthermore, as he later wrote in his first letter to the community at Thessalonica, were hardly likely to go down well with Orthodox Jews. He described them as the people who killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets, and persecuted us. How displeasing to God they are, and how hostile to all men. It was hardly surprising that not long after Paul and his 2 companions had been in Thessalonica, the Jews became jealous, gathered some of the worthless people from the streets, and formed a mob. They attacked the house of a Jew bearing the Greek name of Jason, because the 3 disturbers of the peace had been lodging with him. Either by chance or forewarned, none of the wanted men were in the building. Jason, however, and some other Christians were dragged before the magistrates. The charge was that they are all breaking the laws of the emperor, and saying that there is another king, called Jesus. The charge, in effect, was true. That was exactly the message that Paul was proclaiming, and his proclamation of the second coming suggested to simple minds a great king shortly to arrive from the east, who would overthrow the Roman Empire. In Thessalonica, unlike Philippi, the magistrates were cautious. News of the Roman status of Paul and Silas may well have reached them. All they wanted, like almost all the authorities with whom Paul came in conflict during his life, was peace, progress, and normal trading within the area of their authority. Who can blame them? That was exactly the purpose for which they had been appointed. Then along came this Jewish troublemaker, with some crazy story about another Jew who apparently had been crucified and survived it, impossible, and who was going at some time in the near future to become ruler of the world. Jason was a well-known citizen. So were a number of others, including some women of good standing, who also shared this absurd but also dangerous belief. The best thing to do was to make them all put down a bond to ensure that they would in no way break the peace. And, of course, the promoters of this seditious nonsense must be got out of the city as quickly as possible. 28. Rejections. The small town of Berea lies in the foothills of Mount Olympus, popular then as now for its indulgent summer climate, where cool winds fan the mountainside, while the plains and the coastal strip below are baked with heat. About 20 miles from the sea, it was one of the most ancient towns of Macedonia, and like many others, had its Jewish colony. Jason and the converts in Thessalonica had no doubt suggested it as a suitable retreat for Paul and Silas, and as having a community in the local synagogue who were receptive to new ideas. Timothy, it would appear, stayed behind in Thessalonica, to rejoin them in Berea later. Neither he nor Luke seemed to have been as predisposed to getting into trouble as Paul and Silas. But it is noticeable throughout his life that no matter who was with him, Paul ran into trouble. He sought it out, one might say, as determinedly as the pilot of a meteorological aircraft who is investigating storms or hurricanes. His was not the nature of the solid Barnabas, to take people by reason or gentle argument, nor of Luke, the quiet observer. Wherever Paul was, there was the storm center. So, as soon as night came, the brothers sent Paul and Silas to Berea. It was pleasant there, the river racing out cold from the mountain above them, and the people friendly and sympathetic to travelers from foreign lands. A parochial place. The masters of the synagogue listened with pleasure and attention to this stranger, who brought them even stranger news. There was hospitality here, a quickened interest at something unfamiliar coming from the outside world. So the Messiah had really arrived, and would come again, and all would be changed. Good news indeed. They listened to the message eagerly. Many believed, including many Greek women of good social standing, as well as many Greek men. The appeal of Paul's style of preaching to the Greeks is significant. He couched the story of a Jewish Savior in such a way that it was intellectually acceptable to people who were familiar with Dionysus, Demeter, and Orpheus, and who could identify with the whole conception of resurrection and rebirth. Even the Jews seem to have treated this addition to their history with tolerance. Berea was not a place where passions ran high, and whether one believed this wandering Pharisee or not, there was no reason for being disrespectful to him. He was a Roman citizen furthermore, respectable indeed even in that, as well as in his impeccable background, taught by Gamaliel and none other. Berea was a charming backwater. Paul had no doubt long been hoping to take the Via Egnatia and head for Rome across the Adriatic. Rome was always what he sought, the heart of power, the heart of darkness, where he could set fire to the aspirations of millions. Once again he had been deflected, and pleasant though this provincial town was, he burned to go westward. But even Berea soon proved too hot to hold him. Word got back quite naturally and very soon that there were 2 new Jews in the community, with a most unusual message. It suggested that all the writings of the prophets had been fulfilled in a man called Joshua, Jesus, and that the second coming of the Messiah was imminent. A dangerous doctrine, and one which could well imperil the lives of all Jews within the empire. After all, as was now known in most Jewish communities, except perhaps a few provincial townships like Berea, the Emperor Claudius had recently expelled the Jews from Rome, for the very reason that these Christ believers were a danger to the state. The trouble may probably have originated from the Sanhedrin, which exercised a powerful discipline throughout the ranks of the synagogues. And as Jews were always coming and going upon the peaceful highways of the empire, there was no difficulty in keeping in communication with one place and another. At the same time, this theory of Sanhedrin intervention, which has been widely canvassed, thus laying the blame upon the leaders of Judaism, needs some consideration. From it derives some of the later Christian condemnation of the Jewish race, something quite as illogical as the Hitlerian persecutions, which had absolutely no foundation in Christian belief. Jews irritated people. They said that they were different, chosen by the God of the whole universe, and destined to be the only ones admitted to some divine kingdom, when the rest of humanity would be swept away into outer darkness. Another irritating factor was that, for some still unexplained genetic reason, they seemed undoubtedly more clever than most other races. No one could deny that the Jew was better at business even than the Phoenician, another Semite. And no one could deny that their private lives were quieter and more dignified than those of other nationalities. They did seem to have some extra quality, and this was hardly likely to make them popular with their neighbors. Then along came another but very different sect of Jews, who admitted foreigners into their cult, but who proclaimed that they were even more special than the Jews themselves. When the news reached Thessalonica that Paul and Silas were in Berea, the reaction was immediate. It is always easy, in any community in the world, to hire a crowd of ne'er-do-wells who care nothing for the issues concerned, but who will promote a demonstration for the sake of money. Once again there was trouble, mob violence, and once again Paul had to fly for his life. It is notable that both Silas and Timothy, who had now joined them, stayed in Berea. It was Paul whom the authorities were after, constantly. This is proof enough that he was the outstanding advocate of the belief in Christus, and that his belief was seen as a revolutionary one. Although the author of Acts gives us no details except that the brothers sent Paul away to the coast, and that he subsequently arrived in Athens, it is almost certain that he went there by sea. A number of authors have stated that he reached Athens by the overland route, but this seems quite illogical. Berea was about 20 miles from the sea. At Methone, on the Thermaic Gulf, was the direct center for communications with all the major ports of the Aegean world. Philip, the father of Alexander the Great, had lost an eye during a siege of the town. It was certainly from Methone that Paul took ship for Athens. The usual coastal route awaited him, but through some of the loveliest scenery in the Aegean. One cannot believe that, obsessed though he was with the vision of another world, Paul was not moved by the magnificent coastline of Greece. His letters prove him a poet, one of the greatest who ever lived, and there is in his imagery something not entirely Hebraic, something reminiscent of the strange clarity of Greece. He was alone now, alone for the first time in his known missionary activities, although clearly he had often been alone in the missing years. One doubts whether it troubled him very much, for he was never, in a sense, lonely. Whatever had happened to him on the road to Damascus had changed his life totally, and had given him a constant sense of the omnipresence of God. The vessel would most probably have turned west to come under the lee of Euboea, the long fish-shaped island that gives protection against the northerly winds of the Aegean. Paul's coaster would undoubtedly have had oars as well as sails, for the passage between Euboea and the mainland of Greece would have been practically impossible for a ship dependent on sails alone. In the Euboea Channel, he would have seen the roaring tide, whose streams can run at as much as 7 or 8 knots. He will have seen, too, the shoreline race by, near the town of Chalcis, where the distance between Euboea and Attica is no more than 130 feet. There is no indication that Paul was familiar with Homer, but his fellow passengers would certainly have been. He must have heard as they passed the Bay of Aulis how it was here that the Greek fleet, bound for the siege of Troy, had to wait for a favorable wind. It was here that Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia, was supposed to have offered herself as a sacrifice to the goddess Artemis, in order to ensure that the fleet had a successful passage across the sea to Troy. The traditional site of her death is now commemorated by a small whitewashed chapel dedicated to St. Nicholas. On his right hand lay the district known as Boeotia, whose name has come down to us in the word Boeotian, as being synonymous with peasant-like stupidity. That is because the Athenians wrote the literature. Boeotians were not so much stupid as astute and cunning. Christopher Wordsworth says, "It was the policy of Boeotia, contrived with more than Boeotian shrewdness, to make Euboea an island to everyone else but themselves. They locked the doors of Athenian commerce, and kept themselves the key. This was the channel by which the gold of Thasos, the horses of Thessaly, the timber of Macedonia, the corn of Thrace, were carried to the Piraeus." But all this was long in the past, long before the rise of Rome, long before the domination of Greece by the legions from Italy. Paul lived in eternity, in a timeless world, obsessed with the end of time, and with the beginning of a new era, when, in the words of Shakespeare, time must have a stop. Ancient legends would have meant little or nothing to him. But the sight of Athens, of the fabulous buildings capping the great rock of the Parthenon, of the immense statue of Athena, that landmark to sailors, cannot have failed to shake his nerve. Little towns, Berea, Lystra, Tarsus, or even Antioch, cannot have prepared him for the astonishment of Athens. There she stood, the monument of all the ages, the home of the greatest intellects that the Mediterranean world had ever known, the source to which, even 5 centuries after her Periclean glory, every Roman who could afford it sent his son in order to make of him a truly cultured man. The Acropolis, rising some 180 feet above the plain, flashed with the glorious marble that the Athenian genius had turned into some of the greatest architecture in the history of the world, buildings which were emulated by the Romans then, as they are emulated to this day. The city staggered the eye. Paul suffered a loss of confidence. It is notable that his later encounters with the men of Athens do not show him at his most formidable. Even a Jew cannot make a living in Athens, so runs a local saying. Certainly, the quick-witted Athenians had little to learn about commerce or craftsmanship, or indeed almost anything from other nations. There was, though, as would be expected, a Jewish community complete with its synagogue. Paul, as usual, made straight for the heart, arguing with Jews and Gentiles who worshipped God. The account does not show him as having made any converts at this early stage. The city's smiling indifference angered him. Everywhere he turned he was confronted with marble gods and goddesses, many of them painted in vivid primary colors. Altars smoked, incense billowed out of temples, people made private offering at little shrines. Priapic statues with erect penises, lovingly and jokingly touched by passers-by, stood close to statues of naked women, heathen idols. The whole air vibrated with a splendid disbelief in practically everything, except in life itself. It is curious, perhaps, that Paul, brought up in Tarsus and familiar with paganism from his earliest years, should have reacted so strongly against these surroundings. One may conclude that even his certainty was somewhat undermined by all these other certainties. Paul, like many others, philosophers, scholars, students, and men with time on their hands to do little but hear the latest new thing, got into discussions, debates, and arguments in the agora, the marketplace, where transactions were intellectual as well as material. Inevitably, he met with Stoics and Epicureans, for they were the predominant leaders in philosophy at this time. Indeed, it might well be said that Stoicism and Epicureanism still remain at the core of much human thought. Stoics, although like later Christians they came in a variety of shades, basically maintained that man has an invisible quantity, a soul, whose true home is not on this earth, but in the remote universe, in the light of the sun, or in the eternal silence of the stars. Man must not fear death, for either it is no more than absorption into the universe, into the absence of consciousness, which, as far as he knows, was his condition before birth, or it is a new birth into the consciousness of the God who made all things. E.H. Blakeney, in his Classical Dictionary, summarized the Stoics. They derived their name from the painted hall at Athens, called the Stoa, literally porch. Stoicism is mainly a great ethical system. Philosophy takes the place of religion in that system, and this philosophy is the exercise of virtue, the setting forth of wisdom as a truly practical interest. According to the Stoics, virtue consists in 1. Absolute judgment. 2. Absolute mastery of desire. 3. Absolute control of the soul over pain. 4. Absolute justice. The keynote of the system is duty. There is nothing that Paul would have been unfamiliar with here, and little, except in his proclamation of a man-God, that Stoics would have found unfamiliar in Paul's Christo-Judaic ethics. Admirable though Stoicism was, however, there was one vast and salient difference between this philosophy and the religious belief preached by Paul. Stoicism meant acceptance. It had much in common with the kismet of the Moslem, the acknowledgement of the foreordained pattern, which a real man should look straight in the eye and not try to evade. Paul's message was that the world could be changed. That man, through faith in Christ, had a power over his destiny. Over and above all that, permanent and perpetual compassion was the quality that God desired of the human race. Stoicism was noble, but somewhere at the core there was an emptiness. Epicureanism, on the other hand, was, though far from as simple as some later commentators would have us believe, basically centered around the idea that the prime object of life was happiness. Mistranslated by numerous of the followers of Epicurus, and constantly mistranslated in later centuries, the teaching of this very remarkable man had practically nothing to do with the delights of sensual pleasure. Born in the 4th century B.C., in the island of Samos, Epicurus took up permanent residence in Athens in 306 B.C. The highest good, he taught his followers, was happiness, something which could only be achieved by peace of mind, resulting from the cultivation of virtue. Whereas the Stoics made virtue an end in itself, Epicurus saw it as a means. Quietude of mind and a steadfast faith he enjoined, adding that a right conception of pleasure conduces to right living, since it is not possible to live pleasantly without living wisely and well and righteously. He had died in Athens in 270 B.C., aged 72. It was the latter-day descendants of these two principal schools of thought with whom Paul was now to dispute, announcing his resurrection of Jesus. He was, of course, misunderstood. They were all prepared to discuss the nature of man, his place in the universe, and the existence of an all-powerful God. They were not ignorant idol worshippers. That was for the general populace, for the peasantry, who needed obvious and simple reminders of the natural forces that shaped the world. But what on earth was this strange little Jew talking about? The idea of the physical resurrection of the body was ludicrous. Everyone had been to funerals. Everyone knew that whether interred in the earth or burnt on a funeral pyre, the material body returned to the earth, was reformed into the atoms of which everything was made. At that moment in Rome, the Stoic philosopher Seneca was saying that every right-thinking man was a pilgrim in search of the good. He was endeavoring to put this kind of wisdom into the mind of a pupil, who unfortunately was not to do him much credit, the future Emperor Nero. Paul's passionate advocacy of his belief did not make much impression upon these scholarly and cultured Athenians. What, they asked, is this ignorant spermologus trying to say? A spermologus meant literally a seed snapper, a man who picked seeds from the gutter in order to keep alive, or as in this case, a man who grabbed the seeds of other men's ideas, and then, without really comprehending them, hawked them about as his own. Who was he to come to Athens, the home of philosophy, and try and tell them about some completely obscure figure? And what exactly was his message? He seems, said some of them, to be talking about foreign gods. They were well used to new cults and mystery religions coming out of the East, but few of them would stand the scrutiny of a trained mind. Yet it is evidence of the extraordinary personality of Paul that the Athenians took him seriously enough to invite him to a public meeting on the hill of Ares, the Areopagus. In former times, this had been the criminal court of the city, where murderers or men accused of crimes against the state were taken to state their case before the council. It is doubtful at this time whether the council ever met, but the hill of Ares still meant in Athenian eyes the seat of judgment. This was where the truth was established. 2 prominent white stones marked the place where accused and prosecutor took their stands. One, the stone of shame, and the other, the stone of ruthlessness. It is more than doubtful that either Paul or any of the interrogators actually stood upon these ancient symbols of the days when Athenians had been the proudest citizens of Greece and had conducted all their own affairs. Nevertheless, the implication was still there, and if not fully understood by Paul, would certainly have been understood by his audience. This foreigner, with his Cilician Greek, who maintained that all their philosophers were wrong, and that he had some magic key to the universe, was being put on intellectual trial. If he was right and they were wrong, then let him prove it. They at least were showing that Athenian liberalism was extended to all, even to obscure wandering Jews, provided, of course, that they were prepared to defend their opinions and to argue them rationally. Paul began well enough. "Gentlemen of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious." They accepted that, although it somewhat smacked of patronage coming from a stranger, and being addressed to the heirs of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, to mention but a few names out of their vast intellectual heritage. Now he was talking about an altar dedicated to an unknown god. There was nothing particularly uncommon in that. There were many in the world with a similar dedication. All it meant was that people did not want to offend any deity who might possibly have been forgotten during the erection of altars throughout this or other cities. He worshipped this unknown god? How very peculiar. And now he was going on to say that this god of his had made the world and was ruler of the universe. This was nothing new. He must have been reading Cleanthes's great hymn, "Most glorious of immortals, O Zeus of many names, almighty and everlasting sovereign of nature, directing all in accordance with law." They did not need to know that God does not live in temples. Their distant ancestors might have thought so, but they knew well enough that temples were only visible symbols of belief, and that the statues and paintings in them were a comfort to the masses. Let him get to the point. What exactly was it that he had to tell them that was new? Ah, now at last it came. There was going to be a day of judgment, when the whole world would be judged with justice by a man whom this God of his had chosen. Unbelievable. And even more unbelievable, this judge had already lived on earth, and had been raised from the dead. This was too much. Those who had merely been yawning began to laugh. They had really wasted their time coming to listen to this ignorant, arrogant, and quite absurd mountebank. But still, they must not forget that they were Athenians. They must extend the normal courtesy to a visitor, even if they would never again bother to listen to him. We would like to hear you on the subject some other time. Surprisingly enough, in view of the intellectual climate of Athens, not all were skeptical. As Paul left the Areopagus, a number of people followed him, who wanted to hear a great deal more about this belief. Among them was a member of the Areopagus Council, Dionysius, as well as a woman named Damaris. His opportunity to talk to the wise in the wisest city in the world had not been an entire failure, but it had not been a great success either. If it had been a success, there can be no doubt that he would have stayed on in Athens. But after this, Paul left Athens and went on to Corinth. The brief statement is testimony to a rejection. 29. A tent maker in Corinth. Corinth, the ancient rival of Athens, was in mythology the home of the sorceress Medea, of Sisyphus, who was condemned for his rapacity in life, eternally to roll a huge marble stone uphill in Hades, and of Bellerophon, who attempted to fly to heaven on his winged horse Pegasus. Traditionally, the birthplace of navigation and commerce, and the originator of the trireme, it had once been the greatest trading power from the gulf that bears its name to the islands of the Ionian Sea, Sicily, and Italy. The Corinth Paul saw was a new creation. In 146 B.C., the year that Rome defeated and sacked Carthage, the same treatment had been handed out to Corinth. Infuriated by a series of insurrections in Greece, the Romans had decided to make an example of this powerful and famous city. Lucius Mummius, the consul in charge of the operation, had done his work with devastating thoroughness. Corinth had been razed to the ground. The home of philosophers like Diogenes, who had once openly rebuked Alexander the Great, the home of some of the greatest craftsmen and gifted artists in Greece, was obliterated. Its men were killed, its women and children sold into slavery, and the vast accumulation of art treasures in the city were transported to Rome. Mummius then proceeded with typical Roman canniness to ensure in his contract with the shippers of all this loot that if any of the art treasures were lost in transit, they must be replaced by others of equal value. His own values were those of the victorious nouveau riche conqueror, ignorant of the refinements of life. The city had been refounded in 44 B.C. by Julius Caesar, in the very year of Caesar's assassination. By this time, Greece had become a Roman protectorate, and Corinth was now made a colony. It became the capital of the province of Achaia, and was resettled by Roman veterans and descendants of freedmen. Paul may have reached the city by the overland route from Athens, although it is equally likely that he took a coaster from Piraeus, the main commercial harbor of Athens, and went to Cenchreae, the port on the eastern side of the Isthmus of Corinth. It was this narrow strip of land, dividing the Aegean from access to the Ionian Sea, that had first given the city its commercial importance. Boats were transported across the isthmus on a system of rollers to Lechaeum, the harbor of Corinth. The long sea route round the southern point of Greece was thus obviated, as well it needed to be. Cape Malea is one of the most dangerous points in the Mediterranean, and an old saying had it that the man who rounded Cape Malea might as well forget that he ever had a home. Corinth was above all a sailor city, renowned for its drunkenness and debauchery. It had been the home of the famous Lais, a courtesan of beauty and wit, whose most famous lover was Aristippus, the Cyrenaic philosopher. She, as it were, set the tone for the city, and it was to Corinth that businessmen from Athens came when they wished to escape from the eyes of their neighbors for a week or so of old wine and young mistresses. Above the city, soaring out of the plain to a height of 1,900 feet, rose Acrocorinthus, where the citadel of Corinth gave it dominance over all the neighborhood. Strabo, who gives a detailed description of the city, tells us that the peak of the mountain was not only devoted to war. Above the city, soaring out of the plain to a height of 1,900 feet, rose Acrocorinthus, where the citadel of Corinth gave it dominance over all the neighborhood. Strabo, who gives a detailed description of the city, tells us that the peak of the mountain was not only devoted to war. Here, as on Mount Eryx in Sicily and at Paphos in Cyprus, there was a temple dedicated to Astarte, Aphrodite, Venus, the goddess of love, that was served by 1,000 priestess prostitutes. Although the ancient glories of Corinth had long gone and been replaced by pure commercialism when Paul came walking down the dusty way, where the slaves hauled the ships to east and west, the atmosphere must always have been much the same. Here money talked. Money could buy you anything and everything. It was a far call from quiet Berea, or even from Athens, come to that, where intellect was still prized above all else. Paul was in for a surprise. He knew, of course, that there was a flourishing Jewish community in Corinth, along with its synagogue. But what he can hardly have counted on was finding that in advance of him there were some Christians in the community. Only 2 are mentioned, although there may possibly have been others. These were Aquila, a Jew born in Pontus, on the southern shores of the Black Sea, and his wife Priscilla, a diminutive of the Roman name Prisca, both of whom had settled in Corinth after their expulsion from Rome under the Claudian edict. They too followed the same trade as Paul, and he settled with them and took up his tent-making again. Aquila, Priscilla, and Paulus, tent-makers. It is not an impossible shop sign. Paul, like any rabbi, had been taught that the teacher or exponent of the law must never be a burden on the community, but must pay his own way, earn his own bread. A very proper aspiration, and one which has, unhappily for all concerned, been forgotten by too many sects of Christians in subsequent centuries. Paul may often have seemed anathema to the Jews, but it was the iron core of Judaism in his nature that made him so successful a Christian revolutionary. As usual, he was given a hearing in the synagogue, where he argued every Sabbath, trying to convince both Jews and Greeks. He was later to thank the people of Corinth for their treatment of him, and to confess that he had come to them nervous and shaken with fear. The words are interesting, for they can hardly refer to his treatment in Athens, where he had been heard with skepticism but not with violence. It is possibly right to assume that the cumulative effect of his treatment in other cities had prepared him for further beatings, stonings, and mobbings. His courage and physical endurance, over hard roads, through mountain passes, on wet, wave-swept decks, in shipwrecks and storms at sea, as well as human storms in cities, never deserted him. Few soldiers in the cult of Mithras, dedicated though they were to a belief in the value of courage, could have equaled the endurance of this small, balding Jew, who was also often physically ill. Paul was a living proof that the weaknesses of the body are surmountable, and that there is in the power of the will some force which has still escaped medical or psychological analysis. When Silas and Timothy rejoined him from Macedonia, they brought disquieting news. First of all, the Christians were being persecuted by the Orthodox Jews, who were saying that Paul was nothing more than a charlatan, and that his whole message was a lie. This in itself was bad enough, although only to be expected. But what Paul possibly could not have expected was that his insistence that the second coming was imminent had led among some to a complete breakdown in morale. If the end of the world was at hand, why bother with attempting to get on with one's daily life? Why indeed work at all? Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians was one of encouragement. It was dictated by him, but very probably written by Timothy. It would have been on the standard papyrus sheets, which were among Egypt's main contribution to the bureaucracy and the communications of the ancient world, written with a pen made out of reed, and ink composed of gums and soot. The dialect is the colloquial demotic of the day, with, very naturally, a sprinkling of Hebraisms. It opens in the normal style of ancient letters, with a conveyance of greetings, proceeds then to the substance, and closes with a blessing. Very probably, it was conveyed back to Thessalonica by Timothy in person. He seems to have been both amanuensis and courier to Paul. It is significant that in his second letter to the Thessalonians, he concludes with what might be termed a trademark, a personal salutation, which he takes care to put in his own hand, adding, "This is my mark of identification in every letter. I write as follows: The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all." It is quite clear that some spurious letters must have been in existence, letters which can only have been forged by enemies of this doctrine, Orthodox Jews almost certainly. Why would pagans and others have cared in the slightest what one obscure foreigner was writing to another small group of foreigners? But in Corinth, as elsewhere, it was inevitable that the vehemence of Paul's proselytizing would lead to trouble. The Jews denied that his arguments about Christ being the Messiah were convincing. As always, They were not going to have the Savior of Israel compared to a man who had been crucified between two thieves. Nor were they going to hear that this was the doing of the Jews themselves. Paul was no longer welcome in the synagogue. They abused him, called his so-called Messiah by evil names. Paul responded with the traditional gesture, shaking off the dust from his clothes, and saying, "Your blood be upon your own head. I take no blame for it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Yet despite this, Paul had managed to convert Crispus, who is described as a leader of the synagogue. He had baptized him and all his family, so it could hardly be said that he had entirely failed with his own race. He now took up residence with a certain Titius Justus, a Gentile whose house stood next to the synagogue. From his name, he was presumably a Roman, possibly a descendant of one of the retired legionaries or freedmen with whom Julius Caesar had repopulated the city. A sum of money now reached Paul from the community at Philippi. It is likely that he abandoned his tent-making at the same time as he moved into the house of Justus. Paul had over a year of more or less undistracted preaching and instruction in Corinth, and it seems almost certain that the majority of his converts were made among the Greeks and Romans. Despite his rejection by most of the Jews, he was comforted by a vision in which Jesus spoke to him, telling him that he must carry on with his mission, and that he would not be harmed, for "I have many people in this city." But in the summer of 52 there was a drastic change. In July that year, a new proconsul of Achaia was appointed, Lucius Junius Annaeus Gallio. He was a man of some distinction, the brother of the philosopher Seneca, whom the poet Statius refers to as Sweet Gallio. Seneca also wrote of him that no one was ever so pleasant as Gallio is to everyone. This, then, was not the hard Roman proconsul of tradition, but a man of culture and sensitivity. The Jewish community now made a grave mistake. They thought that with the change of government, they might find a Roman new to the office who would be willing to accede to their request. And the request was very simple: remove Paul from Corinth. The Jews got together, seized Paul, and took him to court. These are the brief words of Acts. There is no mention of Silas, no mention of Timothy. It was always Paul who caused the dissension. Because of his formidable power of argument, he could upset the elders of any community, and make them feel inferior in front of all the others. If they would not believe, then let them perish. Such confidence does indeed move and inspire many of the people in this world, most of whom, in any case, do not know what their true opinions are. But it is certain to make enemies. Once again, no doubt beaten and mauled, this indomitable aging man was dragged in front of the ruling authority. The charge laid against him was that he was trying to persuade people to worship God in a manner that was against the law. What did this really mean? There were many gods. There were indeed myriads of gods, each and all with their different rituals and ceremonies. So how could it be possible to teach people to worship some Oriental god in a way that was against the law? And by the law, of course, was meant the law of Rome, not that of the Jewish Torah. The answer, which is often evaded, is simple enough. Paul was teaching what in effect, if not in reality, was subversion against Rome and against the emperor. He was teaching the end of the world, the imminent arrival of a Jewish king, who was king above all kings, the destruction of Rome and all that it stood for, and the uprising of a small group of Jews and Gentiles who would create a new kind of state. This, at any rate, was how it appeared to many people, and certainly how the Orthodox Jews always wanted to make it appear to the Roman authorities. Unfortunately for them, they met their match in the liberal and sensibly minded Gallio. Gallio has often been produced as another Pontius Pilate, anxious only to wash his hands of the whole affair. This is far from true. Having listened to the charge that this man is trying to persuade people to worship God in a way that is contrary to the law, he came to the conclusion that the law of Rome was in no way being broken. Apparently, it was all a matter of a different interpretation of some aspect of Jewish religion and history. It seemed to him to have no connection with any material offense. These Jews were the most troublesome people in the empire. The Gaul, the German, the barbarous Briton even, were no trouble compared with this violent little race out of the East. The emperor, and wisely as it would seem, had just banished them from Rome. Yet here they were in Corinth, indulging in exactly the same tedious disputes. Gallio's decision was simple. If, he said, this was a matter about some wrongdoing or crime, I would be reasonably patient with you Jews. But since it is simply an argument about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of such matters. After this, he had them all removed from the court. The Jewish community felt that the whole affair had been mishandled by the leader of the synagogue, Sosthenes, who had clearly concentrated on offenses against the Jewish law. What he should have impressed upon the Roman was that Paul was proclaiming a doctrine that was a threat to Caesar. In their fury at the outcome of the issue, they seized Sosthenes and beat him in front of the court. But that did not bother Gallio at all. These Jews, he thought, no doubt. Well, that was clearly one of them who was not going to bother him any more. Paul went away free. 30. The traveler again. The proconsul's decision meant that Paul was able to continue uninterrupted in his activities. The Jews, no doubt chastened by their experience of the cool indifference of Gallio to their private feuds and disputes, kept themselves to themselves. In the spring of 53, when in early March the sailing season was officially declared open, Paul left Corinth. He had been there for at least a year and a half. He had seen the establishment of a strong core of believers, and he can only have felt that his time there had been well spent. Corinth, like Alexandria, to which he never went, was, by reason of its shipping activities, one of the nerve centers of the Roman world. Sailors and merchants who had been converted would spread the word through the blue arteries of the Mediterranean, taking it to other seaports all over the body of the empire. With Paul went Aquila and Priscilla. Acts mentions laconically that, before sailing, he made a vow in Cenchreae and had his head shaved. This is extremely interesting, for it suggests that Paul had been ill. It was an ancient custom among the Jews, if they had been dangerously ill or in other ways distressed, to take a vow to go to the temple in Jerusalem. As token of this, they shaved their heads, kept the shorn hair, and then ceremonially burnt it at the altar. Now Corinth was notorious for being malarial. Gallio himself contracted it during his office there, and went off on a sea voyage to restore his health. Paul had no other reason, as far as is known, to feel distressed. His time in Corinth had been extremely fruitful. If, as some have assumed, he had already contracted malaria while in Asia Minor, a second attack would have been very serious. He also mentions in his letter to the Romans, written some 4 years after his visit to Corinth, a deaconess of the small Christian church established at Cenchreae, named Phoebe, who has nursed myself and many others. Aging, most probably still shaken by terrible recurrent bouts of fever, Paul and his 2 friends now embarked on a coaster across the Aegean, heading for Ephesus. It will have been too early for the steady northerlies, the Meltemi, to have been blowing. But assuming it was April when they finally got under way, the prodromes, the forerunners of the Etesian winds, will have started. Variable in strength and direction, they are nevertheless handy for small boats, and one may assume that Paul was embarked on a typical Aegean coaster. She was probably taking manufactured goods from Corinth to sell in the great market of Ephesus. Salamis to the north of them, craggy Aegina to the south, past Athens shining in all its glory. They will then have raised Cape Sunion on their port bow. There, giving them its blessing, stood the great temple of Poseidon, the god himself with his trident, promising them freedom from harm, as they sailed across the sea of the kingdom. Very likely, if the wind permitted, they took the shortest route, going north of the island of Zia, and then through the Androstinos Channel. Paul's writings are full of music. It is impossible to believe that he was not moved on spring days and nights as they made their way through those lovely islands. They were far greener and more fertile then than now, although even by the 1st century many of them had been despoiled of their trees in the hunger for wood to build ships such as that in which Paul was traveling. Lonely, dolphin-shaped Icaria they left to the south, and then they were passing all the grandeur of Samos, with its 2 great mountains spinning up like tops out of the Aegean, and dominating the fertile plains below. Throughout their voyage, they had hardly ever been out of sight of land, of islands, which had furnished an imagery for generations of Greek poets. And it must never be forgotten that this Jew, like so many of his race, was a poet as well as a religious. Indeed, it is hardly possible to be one without the other. Their stay in Ephesus was brief, Paul's intention being no more than to see that all was going well with the congregation before hastening on to Jerusalem. It was comforting and peaceful. His next visit to the city would be very different. Aquila and Priscilla stayed behind, presumably to set up their tent-making business again, and to provide at the heart of the Christian community a firm core that would make sure that the belief was not misinterpreted. Paul went on alone, days and nights in a merchantman along the Asian coast, north of Rhodes, where they probably stopped in the sun god's island to unload merchandise and let passengers disembark and take on others, and so across the sea, south of Cyprus, to land at Caesarea. Paul's second great journey was over. The traveler stood in the temple and fulfilled his vow. He had said to the congregation at Ephesus that he hoped to return to see them, if it is the will of God. After leaving Jerusalem, he made his way north again to Syrian Antioch. He was ending his second expedition in the place from which he had begun his first. After all, it was the community at Antioch that had first sent him out, and it was only right and fitting that he should come back to his emissaries and give them all the news in person. It is true that there were many other travelers on the roads and waterways of the Roman world, but Paul's obsessional traveling is quite unique. He must often have slept rough, constantly sailed under the cheapest conditions, and more often than not, when he could not afford a mule or a horse, have traveled the roads of the Eastern Empire in sweat-stained cloak, with his knapsack on his back and staff in hand. Yet it is an astounding tribute to the organization of the empire that he and so many others could move so freely and easily through areas which for thousands of years had been the haunt of bandits and pirates, of warring tribes, of conflicting empires, and of danger, dirt, and inefficiency. Everywhere he went, the hand of Rome was visible. R.H. Barrow in The Romans has commented that the movement of men was as extensive as the movement of goods. Soldiers and traders, officials and civil servants, travelers for pleasure, students and wandering philosophers and preachers, commercial agents, the couriers of the imperial post and of banks and shipping offices, these and many more thronged the roads and the sea routes. The great cities, especially on the coast, were cosmopolitan in their population. Syrians and Greeks, Spaniards and Africans, and scores of other nationalities were mingled in the towns, and served in the same offices and departments or factories or private households. The satirists are never tired of calling attention to the Orontes, a river of Syria, pouring its waters into the Roman Tiber. Men of alien origin brought with them their customs and superstitions, and cults, and moral standards, and Eastern religions spread far into the West. When one considers the size of the area controlled from Rome, and the millions of inhabitants, it is a tribute to the efficiency of Roman arms and communications that the armies which policed the frontiers can hardly ever have numbered more than 500,000 men. About 50% of these were local auxiliaries. Paul's missionary activities, his rescue on more than one occasion from violence, indeed his continued life, were made possible by the Romans. We know little or nothing about his stay in Antioch, so it is reasonable to presume that everything there was in good order. But it was probably during this period, when he had his sights set on a return to Ephesus, that he heard that all was not well in Galatia. The Pharisaic circumcision party had been at work again during his years of absence, saying that a man was not freed from the law just because he had accepted the belief that Jesus had been the Messiah. Paul was furious. These people were undoing the very thing that he had set himself to proclaim, that beyond the Mosaic code there lay another law, one which freed all men who believed. His letter to the Galatians opens formally enough. Paul, an apostle, not from man, nor by means of man, but from Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. He then admonishes them for their backsliding. But there is no doubt, when Paul is enraged, he never spares his enemies. Anathema, he pronounces them, going on to say that, if anyone preaches a different gospel from that which I preach to you, let him be anathema. Although the word had not yet acquired the meaning that it would later in the history of the church, its meaning would be very familiar to people who were acquainted with pagan practices. It indicated the cursing of enemies by means of wax figurines, in which the hair or nail cuttings of the enemy had been inserted, as well as the use of inscribed lead tablets, a number of which have been found, designed to ensure that the curse would endure as long as the lead itself. Although he comforts the believers, although some of his noblest expressions are to be found in this letter, there can be no doubt, after reading it, about the temper of its writer. Paul could spit fire as well as any of the early prophets. He could descend also to good old earthy imagery, not so surprising from one who had traveled the hard way, lived among sailors, and in towns like Corinth. He has this to say about the people who have been contradicting him. I wish that those who are shaking your faith by insistence on circumcision would go all the way, and castrate themselves as well. From Antioch, he set off again north and then west, headed for Galatia and Phrygia. He was absolutely determined that if there had been any backsliding, or any misinterpretation of the message which he had brought to these churches he had founded, he in person would make quite sure that error was corrected. His other aim was to ensure that the relief fund for the poor and for the church in Jerusalem was regularly collected and dispatched, and that every Christian should regularly put aside part of his income for this purpose. Back then again he went, on the long roads through Derbe and Lystra, Iconium and Pisidian Antioch. Older now, but still indomitable, alone and yet never lonely, he walked through all the familiar scenes, through the passes, along the uplands, past the lakes. The soldier with his face set firmly against all enemies, but with his hand extended to all who believed. If Paul had not been what he was, a man blinded by God, he might have been one of the greatest generals the world has ever seen. But he was better than any Alexander the Great. He did not bring death and the sword, but a message of compassion and love that was to transform the whole of this empire, and empires that he can never even have dreamed of. While Paul was on his way through these early congregations, a certain Jew named Apollos, who had been born in Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was clearly a gifted man, an eloquent speaker, and a believer that the Messiah had come in the person of Jesus. However, as Acts puts it, he knew only the baptism of John. That is to say that he, like Paul, preached that the kingdom of God was close at hand, but he clearly was ignorant of other facts, such as the resurrection and Pentecost. Aquila and Priscilla, those pillars of the early church, whom Paul had left behind at Ephesus, assisted in instructing Apollos more correctly as to what the way of God really was. Before Paul reached Ephesus, Apollos had already taken ship for Greece, carrying a letter from the Ephesian community to the churches in Greece. He preached in Corinth, and was apparently a great help to the Christians, defeating the Jews in public arguments, and proving from the prophets that Jesus was the Messiah. An Alexandrian Jew, Apollos will have learned in that most cultured city all the twists and turns of argument. One would like to know more about him, but unfortunately he disappears from the scene. The spotlight turns once more upon Paul. 31. The Great Goddess. He came to Ephesus, not on this occasion just as a passing visitor, but as one who intended to stay for a long time, and to make this powerful and immensely rich city into a stronghold of belief. The city, which he now grew to know well, was, apart from being a major commercial center, a home of occult studies. It was also proud to be known as Neocorus, the servant of the goddess. It was here that the Roman governor of Asia always landed and assumed his office. Although both Smyrna and Pergamum strongly contested the claim, it was generally accepted that Ephesus was the first city of Asia. At a later date, long after Paul himself was dead, it was widely believed that Ephesus was the last home of the Virgin Mary, and that she had died there. This was after the triumph of the Christian Church. There can, however, be little doubt that Mariolatry was no more than an extension throughout the Mediterranean of the worship of the great goddess, the mother of all things, the goddess who had been dominant over this sea since the Stone Age. Diana of the Ephesians was Artemis, the Greek virgin huntress goddess, but she also combined the qualities of the Egyptian Isis. She was, to quote Dr. R.E. Witt's Isis in the Greco-Roman World, "Thou who art worshipped in the shrine at Ephesus." Throughout the novel by Xenophon of Ephesus, it is tacitly assumed that Artemis and Isis perform interchangeable roles. Lastly, writing at the beginning of the 5th century A.D., Macrobius describes the figure of Isis as having the whole body thickly covered with nipples joined together. The total effect was that of great Artemis Isis, as a fertility figure personifying birth and growth. Paul was to find that his doctrine of Christ as the Messiah of the Jews and the Savior of all mankind met with considerable opposition here. The goddess, who had largely given Ephesus its wealth and importance, so that it was a kind of Lourdes of the ancient world, was at the core of so much human thinking. She derived from those early manifestations of religious belief the mother goddess figures to be found from Asia Minor to the Cyclades, and westward to Sicily. The embodiment of the female principle, she represented not only fertility, but resurrection in the shape of new birth, the eternal return of life to the earth, and as found in a number of early carvings, at Tarsienne in Malta, for instance, the tree of life. As Isis, she bore the divine son, Horus, and as Artemis, she was the mother of wild things, the goddess of all animals. The Isis-Artemis conception embraced everything. It could be taken at any level. From the simple peasant's conception of the divinity who would ensure that his beasts and land were fruitful, to the intellectual idea of an all-creating mother who sustained the whole universe. Her temple, one of the 7 wonders of the world, was sited on the plain north of Mount Pion, near a small hill. It was over 400 feet long and 220 wide. It was surrounded by Ionic pillars, 60 feet high, each one of which had been erected by various monarchs as a token of their devotion. It was not the first temple that had been erected at this place, for starting from a small archaic shrine, there had been at least 3 or 4 previous temples. The one which Paul will have seen had taken over 100 years to complete. Much of the cost of its construction had been met by the famous Croesus, the last king of Lydia, whose wealth and power was the byword in the ancient world, as it still is today. It was of Croesus that the tale was told how one day he asked the great Athenian legislator Solon, who was the happiest man in the world, expecting no doubt to be told that it was he. Solon's reply was that no man could be called happy unless he finished his life in a happy way. Some years later, when Croesus had lost a war against the Persian king Cyrus, and was about to be burned to death, he remembered Solon's words, and called out his name 3 times. Cyrus asked him who he was invoking at the end of his life. On hearing the story, he saw that there was also a moral in it for himself, and reprieved Croesus. But all this had taken place 6 centuries before Paul came into the city that was known as the Light of Asia, and saw the astounding temple, which celebrated the female principle, fecundity, and the eternal rebirth of all living things. His basic doctrine was that a man had come into the world who was also God, and that the end of the world was imminent. When that end came, everybody would be judged, and the good and the bad would be separated. The chosen ones would inherit the kingdom, some kind of world that was quite different from this one that was ruled by emperors in Rome. Why should anyone want to believe in the end of the world? People wanted to live happily and enjoy all the pleasures of life as far as they could. Paul's doctrine could hardly appeal to the people of Ephesus, and it is noticeable that he seems only to have made a small number of converts in the city, among some of those who had been baptized in the baptism of John. These he carefully instructed, explaining that John's baptism had only been a token of repentance, but that the baptism of Jesus was that of the Holy Spirit. He took them down to the river Caister, the source of the importance of Ephesus, for it led to the Aegean only 4 miles away, and baptized them himself. The Holy Spirit came upon them. They spoke in strange tongues, and proclaimed God's message. It has been said that Ephesus was the center of occult studies. Indeed, it has been called the home of magic. This prophesying, or speaking in wild and whirling words, was not something confined to the Christians. The followers of Dionysus, and the followers of Isis and Cybele, for instance, were prone, under the influence of wine or drugs, to glossolalia. It would be absurd to accept John M. Allegro's identification of Christianity with an ancient drug cult, based on the properties of the mushroom Amanita muscaria, the sacred mushroom and the cross. At the same time, it would be equally absurd to pretend that Christianity grew up completely untouched by the cults and mystery religions of the ancient world. Paul, like any other man, was influenced by his surroundings. For 3 months he taught in the synagogue, but as usual, the majority of the Jews were hostile to this novel and unpalatable doctrine. So, at the invitation of a schoolmaster, appositely named Tyrannus, the tyrant, he took his small group of believers into the latter's lecture hall, presumably at the end of the day, when lessons were over. Soon, and how natural it was in a city like Ephesus, the rumor grew about that this man teaching a strange mystic doctrine was possessed of supernatural powers. There was nothing new in the idea. Ephesus was full of wizards, sorcerers, witches, astrologers, diviners of the entrails of animals, and people who could read one's fortune by the palm of the hand or the fall of the knuckle bones. Paul, it was said, was a powerful magician, and it was well known that anything associated with a magician was full of power. Power was transferred automatically into anything which had been worn or touched by the one who possessed this mysterious gift. Accordingly, coarse handkerchiefs which he had used, or aprons which he had worn at his tent-making business, were eagerly seized, and, so it was claimed, amazing cures were effected by these efficacious pieces of cloth. The core of the matter here, as always, is the question of belief. It is only in recent years that the power of the mind in relation to matter has been scientifically investigated. Already it has been proved that some people do have the ability to influence, for instance, the roll of dice, or to read a sequence of hidden cards in a manner quite beyond the laws of probability. In the case of the miracles performed by Paul in the course of his life, it is noticeable always that those to whom they have happened believed in him implicitly. It is clear that belief is the necessary switch which turns on the current. There were others apart from Paul, many others, who, whether charlatans or not, were said to have magic powers. The ability to cure diseases, or, in the phraseology of the time, to cast out evil spirits, was claimed by a number of other Jews, among them 7 who are described in Acts as the sons of a high priest named Sceva. Sceva can presumably only have been a rabbi, if that. He and his sons were clearly part of the general throng of nomad mystics who moved from one town to another, like the quack doctors of later ages, handing out their potions or their pieces of papyrus, on which a scribble in Aramaic would seem both strange and powerful to a Greek or Roman, or one of the indigenous natives. Hearing about Paul, and the supposed efficacy of this to them unknown Lord Jesus, they tried to use what they imagined was the mystic formula on a man who was clearly a violent lunatic. Upon their saying to him, "I command you in the name of Jesus, whom Paul preaches," enjoining the evil spirit to leave him, the man replied, "I know Jesus, and I know about Paul. But you, who are you?" He then attacked them, tore off their clothes, and drove them out of the house. The logical sequence to this story is that Paul should have come and cured the man, but there is no mention of it, and it surely would have been recorded. The point again is the same one. The sick man had no belief or faith in these so-called healers. The consequence of this episode was that many Jews and Gentiles who heard about it, and the news would have gone round Ephesus in a few hours, were convinced that this God, about whom Paul spoke, was indeed the true and veritable Savior. In the climate of mind where Attis, Osiris, Artemis, and Isis were all confused, and where men and women were dedicated to so many mythic and mystical concepts, it was hardly surprising that Paul's version of a resurrected God-man was acceptable. They were all filled with fear, says Acts, and many of those who had practiced magic brought their books and burned them openly. It is evidence of the extraordinary power of Paul's personality that these books of magic, which were burned in Ephesus, are said to have been worth many thousands of pounds. It was hardly likely that this episode, somewhat reminiscent of the effects of Savonarola's teachings in 15th century Florence, would have been popular with the majority of people, let alone with those who had a vested interest in the cult of the great goddess. It was to lead to the famous riot in Ephesus. 32. Of human beings. The riot was only to be expected. It is a proof of the success of Paul's work that he had the effect of drawing large numbers of people away from the worship of the great goddess. Since this worship had been in existence for untold centuries, and since Artemis Isis seemed to contain within her legend most of the aspirations of human beings, it is important to ask the question, what exactly did Paul, and his fellow workers like Aquila and Priscilla, have to give that was not given by the goddess? The answer to this is the reason why the great temple in Ephesus is in ruins to this day. The goddess was the whole cosmos, but she did not hold out any hope for human beings beyond the renewal of earthly life. Paul preached a doctrine that, apart from his belief in the imminent end of the world, still stands firm. He taught that goodness, by which he meant the Jewish and Mosaic idea of right behavior towards one's fellows, quite apart from loving the Creator, was the most important thing in the conduct of human life. But above this even came the concept of loving kindness. If one understands this, then one can see why his revolutionary doctrine was ultimately to change the whole of the Roman Empire. One hears, perhaps, the words of Mithraism in "Stand watch, stand steadfast in the faith, act like men, be strong." But in the following sentence, one hears the unique statement, "Let everything you do be done with loving kindness." This message, contained in none of the mystery religions, nor in the worship of Diana of the Ephesians, was the essential yeast in Paul's teaching. The riot was sparked off by a certain silversmith named Demetrius. He was almost certainly the head of the silversmiths' guild, for it is recorded that it was he who brought all the other members of the trade to a general meeting. The complaint of Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen was that the teachings of Paul were causing people to lose faith in Artemis. Now the silversmiths, as in any tourist area in the world, lived largely by making souvenirs. Thousands of people came to Ephesus every year to visit the great temple, and they took away with them small silver models of the temple and of Artemis. Demetrius declared, "Men, you know that our livelihood depends on this trade. You can see and hear what this fellow Paul is doing. He says, gods made by human hands are not gods at all. Not only here in Ephesus, but all over Asia, he has managed to convince people that this is the case. Now there's a great danger that our trade will come into disrepute. More than that, there is also the danger that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will itself come to be despised, and even she, Artemis, whom not only Asia, but all the world reveres, will be stripped of her greatness and come to mean nothing." The appeal to the religious sensibilities of his hearers, as well as to their self-interest, had an immediate effect. Guilds throughout the Roman Empire were, like modern trade unions, extremely touchy and hostile towards any outsiders, let alone to some foreigner who was trying to take away their livelihood. Out came the banners that were borne in the processions. Out came the drums and the clashing cymbals. The cry went up, "Great is Artemis of Ephesus." As always, it was Paul whom the crowds wanted. But on this occasion, he happened to be in the house of some friends, who wisely refused to allow him to leave. Paul asked to go and answer the charges, but by that time the whole city was in a state of riot. Everywhere people were shouting and screaming that the goddess was affronted by these foreigners, that Artemis was the mother of the world, and that Ephesus was the home of the greatest divinity, the only one who had all-embracing power. The mob finally converged on the great theater, having seized en route 2 Macedonian companions of Paul, Caius and Aristarchus. Most of the crowd, as is usual on such occasions, had no idea what the disturbance was all about, except perhaps that some visitors had insulted their goddess,